Thank you very much, Baba, and thank you very much, Michael Tola, for your help and assistance to getting Baba to get this floating. I am absolutely honored to be here, and I'm honored that one of the students who did not meet me in the school evidently is carrying on the tradition that we try to establish in the University of Lagos. And in his hands, with the support of the previous speakers, we can begin to project real, true African architecture with all its importance and its meanings for generations yet to come. The preservation of what we do, what we met in Africa, is one of the weakest points in our arsenal for preserving the true meanings of our culture. The paper he referred to that was my inaugural lecture in 1998, I read through it a couple of times before this lecture. I really don't think I should be reading that again. One of my students in Brazil has translated this inaugural lecture, and we're collecting the photographs for her to make a publication of it in Brazil. And within the next 1 month or two, I will prepare the English version with all the illustrations, and will make this available to Baba to distribute to all of you. But what I will do today is to make a reflection of the past 24 years since that lecture in 1998. And I'm picking 3 topics just to discuss. One is about the Giza Pyramids. And the second is about city projects or new city projects, or what I would call transformation of forms. The audio is gone. The audio is gone. Delete this thing. Okay.
Well, we can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me. Okay, you don't really have to see me. It's migration of forms, which is basically the presence of vocabularies different in architecture and city planning, different from what the traditional societies in Africa had reflected as a response, as their own cultural response to the environment in which they found themselves. And this is one of the battles we have to continue to fight. How meaningful, how relevant is the idiom, the language of modern architecture, a reflection of really how our culture, how we live our culture. And the third one would be one of the most perfect examples, which is the adaptation of the Black people taken from Africa to Brazil, and how they turn their own adaptation into a monumental, relevant experience in Brazil. So let me start with the reflections of the last 24 years. The Giza Pyramids are still standing. European researchers and scholars are still searching for the advanced alien culture which built the Giza Pyramids. During the last 24 years, most of the scholars of the Egyptian pyramids have agreed that the builders of the pyramids, judging by the precision of their coordinates and composition, the pyramids of Giza complex ranks as one of the most extraordinary architectural structures, judging by the highly competitive standards of this century. The administrators of modern-day Egypt, aided by the international agencies funding expansion projects, which continue to disrespect the Giza Pyramids as a burial monuments and sacred place to the Egyptian pharaohs. The Islamic State, the government and the majority of the peoples of Egypt, who are extremely sensitive about their Islamic faith and the sanctity of the resting places of their dead, continue policies which disrespects the sanctity of the pharaohs' resting place. For the British as well as the French colonial officials who first desecrated the memory of the burial resting places of Egyptian kings, looting every project in sight, and defiling the dead royalty of Egypt, the wanton disrespect of the religious beliefs of other people's cultures, as well as the appropriation of the material cultures, is well documented in the British Museum in London. The migration of funds and the impact on the lives and cultures of European colonies continues to be of concern. On land use, habitation, the structure of human settlements, distribution of resources and community accrued wealth, appropriation by the state of communal lands for state use have been abused. The uneducated and poor indigenous have inevitably been at the short end of the state policies of development strategy. In Lagos, from Sierra Leone, free slave city, to resettlement in the Saro town, and the freed slaves from Brazil plantation in Midtown Lagos. Aided by the colonial governor, returnees encouraged the Afro-Brazilians to resettle in Lagos. These two groups were allies of the British administration against the indigenous kingdom of Lagos. The town/row houses of the Catholic Brazilians and the Methodist Church of England's Sierra Leonean lifestyle, as well as the European British sartorial dress patterns, distinguished them and set them apart from the indigenous ruling class. There were new cities which depended on huge land acquisition in Nigeria, Abuja in Nigeria, Dodoma in Tanzania, to name a few. British colonial new towns included Kaduna and Port Harcourt, the former a military cantonment with cities for generals who grew around it, and Port Harcourt, a port city. So the same thing is Lagos, which was developed as a port city. Part of the culture that we inherited from British colonial system, as most countries did in Africa and elsewhere, is that we inherited traditions, we inherited institutions, the full meaning and significance we did not understand. And even if we understood much later, we still have no answer to how to deal with these problems. If you look at the rate of coup d'etat organized by the army that was raised and prepared to defend the territory and the integrity of the colonized countries, it would be surprising that we understood at all why they were set up. The same as we now understand that Lagos is nothing but a city which is set up infrastructurally and funding as a commercial city to receive goods manufactured abroad, for which our competition in terms of industries we set up have no match. These are the realities of the economy we run, which we do not control. the territory we run, which we do not control, and the housing patterns, which we do not control, because we did not understand what we inherited, and we still do not understand how to deal with those things we inherited, even if we understood them. And therefore, you have corridor institutional housing for colonial officers by the British, who built a whole corridor from one end of the city to the other, so they can go from where they live to where they work without having to cross or run into the native section of the town. This pattern is still there. It hasn't changed. Only the new colonial masters are the indigenous Nigerians who were educated, who went to school, and who, through the distribution of the resources of the country, have become the upper class, the controlling group in the economy of the country. And then I go and say that, and continue by saying that the law of eminent domain, which the British set up, enabled them to compulsorily acquire land for any development they wanted. And this law of eminent domain still goes on, exercised by the current government, not only in Nigeria, but also in all colonized entities in Africa. Housing enclaves such as Victoria Island, Lekki Peninsula, were basically prepared by the British before they left. And then the private developers started their own new pattern of taking state land or land belonging to indigenous people, which should have been returned to them. One of these was the Lagoon City project, and the acquisition of Ikoyi Park, which was developed by one of the first Nigerian medical health officer in Girard Road in Ikoyi, was taken over by a private citizen, and he attempted to sandfill that land from Girard Road to Osborne Road. He ran into a problem because he was trying to sandfill the lagoon waterfront where the American embassy residence was located. And the deputy governor or the deputy general in charge of Nigeria was also located, as well as the chief justice. That was actually what stopped that project. The last one is the Lagoon City project, which is a very famous one, which was grafted on the harbor infrastructural foundation wall, which the British had built by the Dutch to enable the boats to come into Lagos Harbor. It was supposed to last 100 years, and it did. The stability of that structure is not guaranteed beyond 100 years. And yet, a new Lagoon City project was predicated on that huge land with more sand filling on the sea. The environmental impact study analysis that was supposed to be done was not done. Not only that, instead of accessing the Lagoon City project from Apapa, which would not have disturbed its location from Victoria Island, they were not willing to spend the money to do that. They created and grafted the access from Victoria Island, which was already choked and actually always heavy traffic on that road. However, in the process of creating that access, the piece of land on Victoria Island sea waterfront which was the only other place that people go to the beach, was seized by the planners of this Lagos Lagoon City, and they created additional housing for themselves and for rent. However, the economy of this Lagoon City project is based on the US dollar currency economy. Finally, when I discuss this issue of transformation of the transformation of forms, the British started it by creating a kind of housing fit only for their own culture. This immediately rendered the culture and the architecture that they met in Lagos, in Nigeria, dated, in the sense that when you put two things together, one new, one old, you create a kind of comparison. And that comparison, importing housing material from London, from Britain, and plotting them down in Lagos, rendered the entire previous architecture that you met in Lagos as a slum, dated, and out of fashion. And this changed the character and the pattern of building in Lagos, made it more expensive in Nigeria for most people. Any city where they went and did this, and they had residents and administrative centers in those places, they created those problems. And those problems of migration of forms is one of the big issues that even the education of the architects and engineering in developing countries has a problem that they have to cope with. Not only are these structures that were built in terms of foreign understanding of architecture, which already characterize what they found in these places as huts. They do not deserve to be called housing. They're just like huts because they do not meet the standard which the Europeans created for architecture. And yet, any shelter, if it satisfies the need, the basic needs of housing, human habitation, is a house. There's no other name for it. But we still struggle with this nomenclature today as we continue to try to educate our youth, our children, in the environment of the African culture, that comparison becomes too strong for them to accept, especially now that the computer system, the internet has become a tool for the education of architecture. And therefore, the temptation to just go to those resources and transform and translate defeats the very basis of trying to create an architecture that is based on a thorough understanding of our indigenous resources, especially the landscape, the climate, and our culture. One of the studies I made with the Ford Foundation funding, what I did with that study was to take a band from the east to the west, several bands from the east to the west in Africa. And when you take any settlement, any village in that particular segment, there is a basic response to the climate, especially if it's a rainfall regime. The roof dominates the walls. As you move northwards, where it is Sahel, the walls contain the roof. But of course, we know that in architecture, a roofing system that is based on shedding the water and covering the entire wall system is a much more intricate and difficult problem to deal with. It is easier to use concrete, which then gives you anywhere some measure of safety only for a period of time, because the performance of concrete depends on several factors. One is that it is consistent when you mix it. Second is that the people who pour it know what they're doing, and they pour it in one batch. Nevertheless, in the intensive, sunny and hot sun regime in West Africa, especially around the equator, you cannot guarantee the performance of the concrete, especially when you have an interchange of sun in a period and then waterfall in a period. It tends to crack very easily and it doesn't hold up. But then when you look into the use of space in any of these structures, even in the same rainfall regime, there are subtle differences which is dictated by the culture of the group that builds and lives in them. In any case, whether you have people from Africa go to live in Europe, or Europeans come to live in climate zones, in different climate zones in Africa, people tend to live their culture wherever they are. They will eat the same way they eat in their own, culturally in their own culture. They would not copy what the Europeans do in Europe. And that is one factor that we do not seem to really appreciate when we create housing for young people, for our culture, in our culture, by our culture. All right, finally, so the migration of farms is a real huge problem. And we keep on, I would say that, for instance, in Lagos, most big architectural projects are now are now being built by foreign architects. We've had in Lagos, we had quite an expansion of architects from South Africa, because they are all connected with these big firms that have projects all over the place, that have institutional marketing system all over the place. And they simply, as we all know in architecture, they use resources and people that they know. That is the problem of architecture. We can be lucky from time to time that we're recognized for our work. But when people have huge projects that they want to do, and they're bringing their money from outside of the entities where we live, they tend to bring their architects with them. The least we could still do is to make sure that where it comes to doing domestic housing projects for the common people in our environment, we do a lot of trying to sensitize them to reflect, and it will cost less to reflect their spaces to accommodate the cultural tendencies or the cultural patterns of their living. Finally, I go back to talk a little bit about the last set of slaves that were taken to Brazil were from Benin Republic and Nigeria, Southern Nigerians. According to the ambassador from Brazil, these were the last group of slaves who were taken to Brazil. There was the key Congo, the current Angola, had been taken centuries, way centuries before. So the Nigerian slaves did not stay long in Brazil before Brazil emancipated them because of the economic situation. They couldn't keep slaves any longer. But the key Congo contribution to the Brazilian language was the inflection of their own language. The Brazilian Portuguese language is a sing-song language. It reflects the key Congo slaves who were taken earlier. But the impact of the West African slaves who were taken to Brazil had a more encompassing hold on the Brazilian culture in terms of the religion, in terms of the dance, samba, the music, and samba, the dance. And I would like to explain that a little bit by reading this small passage, small material which I had at the exhibition I did in 1997 in the old pavilion in Germany. From language to fashion, candomblé to carnival, samba music to samba the dance, the Bantu speaking groups from the old Congo Kingdom and the Fon and Nago Yoruba group from Nigeria, Benin had an indelible influence on Brazilian culture. Africano space embraces a whole range of function and meanings, including the sacred and the symbolic. The Candomblé, a miniature village with a sacred forest, bears the imprint of the Yoruba Nago Fon settlement, with the shrines and temples of Orishas. The Candomblé in Bahia is a shelter with the enclosure of a religious movement, a home with a shared cultural focus and movement de resistance. Oshun and Yemoja are both goddesses, Oshun of sweet water, Yemoja of the sea, with the sacred bata drums. The spirit of the ancestors and the Orishas is assuaged by ritual chants and incantations, supplications of gifts and offerings during ritual festivals. Oshun from Oshogbo in Nigeria and Uida in Benin Republic. Oshun Lukumi in Cuba. Oshun Candomblé in Brazil, and Yemoja in Uida, Yemanja Candomblé, Brazil, and Yemoja Lukumi in Cuba. From Cuba to Trinidad, including Brazil, Chango, the Yoruba god of thunder, lightning, and justice, is the principal god mentioned in songs. In the coastal cities of West Africa, the remarkable recreation of the linear details and ornamentation on the architecture of the mosques and houses, images which must have been discreetly glimpsed as fragments of time, attest to the remarkable power of the creative interpretation and inventive adaptations by generations of locally trained artisans. Thank you very much.